I'd like to start with the address of Pope Benedict to the participants of the Congress A Gift of Life last November here in Rome. The Pope did not mention brain death. Instead, he reflected on some fundamental principles which we have to keep in mind when talking about death and its consequences. First of all, he reminded the audience of the nature of the human being as a unity of body and soul created in the image of God. Then the Holy Father emphasized that individual vital organs can only be extracted ex cadavere and only in the case of his or her death, her true death. Finally, he made clear that in the area of organ transplantation, certainty is very important. Where certainty has not been attained, the principle of precaution must prevail. The judicial background of my presentation is, of course, the right to life, a fundamental right. And I'm talking here as a judge, that's my profession. Judges are not experts in everything, but they have to decide cases involving every matter you can imagine, including life and death matters. Judges are not theologians or neurologists or philosophers. They are just judges. They have to judge, relying on testimonies and expert opinions. If the concept of brain death was of any relevance in one of my cases, you had to convince me that brain death is death. No reasonable doubt be left. Certainty and the principle of precaution are fundamental judicial principles. And a court has to look for the truth. It has to ask what is true death. But the first question is, who is the subject of death, or of a right? In our case, the right to life. So what is a human being? And now you see that the Holy Father would be a good judge, because he mentioned exactly the same question in his statement last year, which a judge has to think about in our context. When we approach the topic of brain death, logically and systematically, I think we have to distinguish four levels of discussion. First, the subject of death, who dies. Second, the definition of death, what is death. Third, the criterion of death, how can we recognize death. And fourth, finally, the tests which actually prove that the criterion of death is fulfilled. I hope we all agree that the topic of organ transplantation should not be mixed up with the question of true death. What we may or may not do with the corpse should not have any influence on the definition or the criterion of death. So who dies? A human being, which is a unity of body and soul. And what is death? The separation of the soul from the body. And how can we recognize death? By the disintegration of the body as a whole. And the question is whether brain death really indicates this disintegration. I'm not going to discuss the last point in depth according to the limited time. And we already heard a lot about the tests. Well, the first level is who is the subject of death. And there's a lot of talk about brain death and clinical death, individual death, legal death, and so on. But that's not correct. We are talking about the death of a human being. We may sometimes use other expressions, but we have to be aware that they are reducing our problem to a certain aspect. The subject of death is a human being, and the human being is more than a body, more than a mere physical thing. And that is also the teaching of the Church. Man is made of body and soul, and it is because of its spiritual soul that the body made of matter becomes a living human body. That's in the Catechism. And it's not that easy to illustrate an immaterial entity on a PowerPoint slide, so my try is this glow in blue, but please don't take it for the real thing. This statement of the Catechism is not only relevant for Catholics. Everyone who reflects thoroughly on life and death will find that the human being is more than just biology. The conviction of the existence of an immaterial life principle is the basis of our individual and social life. As an example, let us ask, who has rights? Can a body have rights? Or a DNA structure? Or neurons? Or brain functions? That is what science tells us about human beings. But that is obviously only half the truth. DNA, neurons, or electric brain waves do not have rights. There has to be something behind these phenomena. The human being is not the sum of its body parts. There's something we call person, self, spirit, or soul, something essentially immaterial. The details of the metaphysical side of man may be subject to philosophical debate, but for our purposes today, we can maintain that according to the teaching of the Church, the human being is a combination of body and soul, and this unity called person is the subject of rights, and in our context, the subject of death. And to be clear about that, the subject of death is not the brain. A few words on the second level of the debate, the definition of death. The question, what is death, has an easy answer. Death is the end of life. But that is not precise enough. Since the body is a living human body because of the presence of the soul, death is the separation of the soul from the body. That is also stated in Catechism. Now we reach level 3. How can we recognize death? What are the signs of death? That's the heart of the matter. Do we understand, do we know how body and soul are connected, united and interacting? Where is the basis of the soul in the body? Is there a special organ hosting the soul? Which organ is it? Or is there such an organ at all? René Descartes argued in 1649 that the pineal gland in the brain is the seat of the soul. But that could never be confirmed, and today nobody claims anymore to know the place where the soul can be found in the body. I think that John Paul II was right when he said that death results from the separation of the life principle or soul from the corporal reality of the person. The death of the person is an event which no scientific technique or empirical method can identify directly. When we can't identify directly the separation of the soul from the body, then we have to approach the problem indirectly. The soul is the life principle. So we have to draw the conclusion that the soul has left the body when there's no life in the body anymore.